Imagine, if you will, a battlefield, but there is no mud here, no trenches, and certainly no gunpowder. Instead, the air is thick with a scent of hothouse orchids and French perfume. The weapons are not bayonets, but embossed cardstock invitations and icy stares. Welcome to Fifth Avenue in the 1880s.
It sounds almost ridiculous to modern ears, doesn't it? The idea that the fate of an entire dynasty could hang on whether a footman delivers a small rectangular piece of paper to a front door. But in Gilded Age New York, this was life and death. Social death, anyway.
Exactly. We are talking about a time when New York City was undergoing a violent transformation. You have the old guard, the Knickerbockers, clinging to their Dutch ancestry and their inherited modesty. And then, crashing against their gates like a tidal wave, were the new money industrialists, the robber barons.
And at the absolute center of this storm stood one woman, Mrs. Caroline Astor. She wasn't just a socialite, she was the gatekeeper. She was the monarch. If you were not recognized by Mrs. Astor, you effectively did not exist in New York society.
That is, until she met her match. Today, we are diving deep into the story of the greatest social coup in American history. It involves a costume ball, a crying teenager, a very expensive French chateau, and a calculated snub that brought the queen of society to her knees.
This is the story of Alva Vanderbilt versus Caroline Astor, the night the old rules crumbled and the modern concept of American high society was born. Buckle up, because the pettiness is off the charts.
To understand why this specific dinner party and subsequent ball were so earth-shattering, we have to understand the landscape of New York in the early 1880s. It was a city split in two.
Right. On one side, you have the Knickerbocker aristocracy. These are families who trace their lineage back to the original Dutch settlers or the early English colonists. The Van Rensselaers, the Squilers, the Livingstons. They valued pedigree over profit. In fact, displaying your wealth was considered incredibly vulgar.
And presiding over them was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Now notice the middle name, Schermerhorn. That was old Dutch money. She married William Backhouse Astor Jr., whose family had made a fortune in fur and real estate, but she was the one with the blue blood. She created a world that was hermetically sealed.
We should explain the Mrs. Astor. She insisted on being addressed simply as Mrs. Astor, as if no other Mrs. Astor existed or mattered. She had a chamberlain, Ward McAllister, who helped her curate her guest lists. They operated on the strict rule: society should be limited to the number of people who could fit in her ballroom.
Which was exactly 400 people. That is where the term the 400 comes from. If you weren't in that ballroom, you were nobody. And the people she explicitly kept out were the new money families, the people who actually built the railroads and the steel mills.
Enter the Vanderbilts. Now, the Vanderbilt fortune was colossal. It dwarfed the Astor fortune. But to Mrs. Astor, the Vanderbilts were trash. The patriarch, Cornelius Vanderbilt, was a rough-hewn, swearing, spitting railroad tycoon. He was seen as uncultured.
But his grandchildren were different, specifically William K. Vanderbilt, and even more specifically, his wife, Alva Erskine Smith. She was from a good Southern family, but after the Civil War, they had lost their money. She married into the Vanderbilt billions with a very specific goal: to conquer New York.
Alva was a force of nature. She looked at Mrs. Astor's polite, dusty old society and decided she was going to buy it, break it, and remodel it. She started by building a house, not just a house, a palace, 660 Fifth Avenue. It was a French Renaissance chateau designed by Richard Morris Hunt.
It was a direct challenge. It was built of limestone in a city of brownstone. It was bright, white, and massive. It screamed, "I am here." But Mrs. Astor ignored it. She would pass by in her carriage and look the other way. In her mind, the Vanderbilts were invisible.
And that is the crucial context. For years, Alva Vanderbilt tried to get in. She threw parties, she wore the finest clothes, she supported the opera. But the doors of the Astor ballroom remained locked. Mrs. Astor had never called on Alva. And in the etiquette of the day, if the queen doesn't visit you and leave her card, you cannot visit her, and you certainly aren't part of society.
It was a stalemate. The irresistible force of Vanderbilt money meeting the immovable object of Astor snobbery. Alva realized she couldn't win by playing Mrs. Astor's game. She had to flip the board.
So here is the masterstroke. The year is 1883. Alva Vanderbilt announces that she is going to host a fancy dress ball, a costume party, to warm up her massive new chateau. It was billed as the party of the century.
The hype for this party was insane. The newspapers were going wild. Tailors in New York stopped taking regular orders because they were so swamped making costumes for the Vanderbilt ball. Everyone who was anyone wanted an invitation. It was the only thing people were talking about.
And crucially, even the children of the old guard were excited. This is where Alva was brilliant. She targeted the younger generation. Caroline Astor had a daughter, Carrie Astor. Carrie was young, spirited, and she was desperate to go to this ball.
Carrie Astor and her friends had actually organized a specific dance to perform at the ball. It was called the Star Quadrille. They had been practicing it for weeks. They had their costumes made. They were ready for their big moment.
Picture the scene. Carrie is breathless with excitement. She's practicing her steps. And then Alva Vanderbilt drops the hammer. She casually let it be known to one of Carrie's friends that, unfortunately, she could not invite Miss Astor.
Why? Because, Alva explained with feigned regret, Mrs. Astor has never called on me. And according to the strict rules of etiquette, rules that Mrs. Astor herself upheld, one cannot invite a guest whose family one does not know socially.
It was a trap, a perfect diamond-encrusted trap. Alva used Mrs. Astor's own rules against her. By claiming she couldn't invite Carrie because of a technicality, she put the ball squarely in Mrs. Astor's court.
The result was chaos in the Astor household. Carrie was arguably the most eligible bachelorette in New York, and she was being excluded from the event of the year. She was devastated. We are talking tears, tantrums, the works. She begged her mother to fix it.
Now Mrs. Astor had a choice. She could maintain her pride, keep the Vanderbilts out, and break her daughter's heart while looking like a cruel tyrant. Or she could swallow her pride and acknowledge the Vanderbilts.
For a woman who had spent decades building a fortress of exclusivity, this was a humiliating prospect, but the pressure was too great. The Vanderbilt ball had become bigger than the Astor approval. Alva had made her party essential.
So the inevitable happened. It is one of the most cinematic moments in social history. Mrs. Caroline Astor ordered her carriage. She dressed in her heavy silks. Her footman helped her in, and they drove up Fifth Avenue.
They stopped at 660 Fifth Avenue, the Limestone Palace. The footman took Mrs. Astor's calling card, a small piece of stiff paper with simply Mrs. Astor engraved on it, and delivered it to the Vanderbilt butler.
That was it. That was the surrender. By leaving that card, she was officially saying, I see you. You exist. You are society. She didn't even have to go inside. The card was the currency.
And almost immediately, literally within hours, a servant from the Vanderbilt house arrived at the Astor mansion with an invitation for Carrie and the rest of the family. The blockade was broken. The Star Quadrille could go on.
The ball itself, held on March 26, 1883, was a triumph. It cost the equivalent of $6 million in today's money. Champagne flowed like water. The costumes were absurdly opulent. Alva dressed as a Venetian princess. Her sister-in-law, Alice Vanderbilt, dressed as Electric Light, wearing a gown that actually lit up with a torch.
Mrs. Astor attended. She arrived late, of course, to make an entrance. She wore a dark velvet gown and enough diamonds to sink a battleship. She went up to Alva and reportedly said, "We have no idea of this feeling of yours at home," meaning we didn't realize you had such nice things.
Talk about a backhanded compliment. But the war was over. The Vanderbilts were in. And once the Vanderbilts were in, the floodgates opened. The Morgans, the Rockefellers, the new industrial money could no longer be denied. The criteria for society shifted from who was your grandfather to how much money do you have.
It fundamentally changed the structure of New York. The 400 list was eventually published by Ward McAllister years later, and by then it included plenty of new money names. The Knickerbocker exclusivity was dead.
It also established the role of the press. Alva invited journalists to the ball. She wanted the public to see. She invented the modern celebrity spectacle. Before this, society was private. After this, it was public performance.
And so the Gilded Age found its new definition. It wasn't about bloodlines anymore. It was about spectacle, expenditure, and raw power. Caroline Astor remained the queen for a while longer, but she ruled over a kingdom that Alva Vanderbilt had redesigned.
It just goes to show, never underestimate the tactical brilliance of a social climber with a grudge and an unlimited budget. The night the Astors were snubbed wasn't just a party. It was a revolution in silken diamonds.
To understand the weight of this snub, and it really was a snub of seismic proportions, we have to first understand the battlefield. In the 1880s, New York City wasn't just a bustling metropolis, it was a fortress. And the commander-in-chief of this fortress wasn't the mayor, it wasn't the governor, and it certainly wasn't the president of the United States. It was a woman named Caroline Schermerhorn Astor.
The Mrs. Astor. And that "the" is capitalized, bolded, and underlined. You didn't just call her Mrs. Astor. She was the only Mrs. Astor that mattered. If you sent a letter addressed simply to Mrs. Astor, New York City, the postman knew exactly where to take it. 350 Fifth Avenue.
Exactly. She was a descendant of the Schermerhorns, an old Dutch family that had been in New York since the days when it was New Amsterdam. For Caroline, lineage was everything. It was the currency of the realm. You could have millions of dollars in the bank. You could own railroads. You could build palaces. But if your grandfather didn't step off a boat before the Revolutionary War, you were essentially invisible to her.
And that's a literal description, right? Invisible. It wasn't that she was rude to the new money families. It was that she simply did not acknowledge their existence. She had this way of looking right through people as if they were made of glass.
That's the Knickerbocker way. The old guard, known as the Knickerbockers, prided themselves on being understated, dignified, and impenetrable. Caroline Astor was the queen of this set. She held court in her brownstone mansion, usually standing under a life-sized portrait of herself, decked out in diamonds. We're talking about a diamond stomacher, a literal vest of diamonds.
Subtle. Very understated.
Well, that was the paradox. They claimed to despise the ostentatious displays of the new rich, but Caroline Astor dripped in jewels. However, to her, those jewels were heirlooms. They were symbols of continuity. The problem arose when the Gilded Age really kicked into high gear after the Civil War. Suddenly, you had these titans of industry emerging, men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and most importantly for our story, the Vanderbilts.
The Vanderbilts are the key here. In 1880, the Vanderbilt family was arguably the richest family in America. The patriarch, Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, had amassed a fortune in shipping and railroads that was frankly unfathomable. But there was a problem. The Commodore was, well, he was rough around the edges.
To put it mildly, the Commodore spat on the floor. He cursed. He ate with his knife. He was a ruthless businessman who didn't give a damn about polite society. He famously said, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" So while he had the money, he didn't have the manners. And in Caroline Astor's New York, manners were the gatekeeping mechanism.
So when the Commodore died and passed this massive fortune to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, and then to his grandsons, the family was desperate to wash off the soot of the railroads and join the elite. They wanted into the club. But the club had a "No Vanderbilts Allowed" sign hanging on the door, written in Caroline Astor's handwriting.
Enter Alva Vanderbilt. This is where the story shifts from a static hierarchy to full-blown social warfare. Alva wasn't a Vanderbilt by blood. She married into the family. She was from a good Southern family, the Smiths of Alabama, but they had lost their fortune after the Civil War. Alva was tenacious, brilliant, and incredibly ambitious. She married William K. Vanderbilt, the Commodore's grandson, and she decided that she was not going to be ignored.
Alva is such a fascinating character because she realized something that the men didn't. She realized that in New York, society was a matriarchy. You couldn't buy your way in with stocks and bonds. You had to buy your way in with culture, architecture, and spectacle. And she knew that the only way to get Mrs. Astor's attention was to force her hand.
And how do you force the hand of a woman who owns New York? You build a castle. Alva and her husband commissioned a mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue that was unlike anything New York had ever seen. Before this, wealthy New Yorkers lived in brownstones, tall, narrow, somewhat gloomy houses. Alva built a petit chateau made of limestone, modeled after the royal palaces of France. It was bright, it was white, and it was enormous.
It was a declaration of war in stone. It sat right there on Fifth Avenue, screaming, "Look at me." It cost $3 million to build in 1882. That is an astronomical sum. But the house was just the stage. Alva needed a play. She needed an event that would be so magnificent, so exclusive, that even the old guard couldn't afford to miss it.
So in early 1883, Alva announced that she would be hosting a fancy dress ball to warm the house. Now, a fancy dress ball, what we would call a costume party, was the height of entertainment. It allowed the rigid Victorians to dress up, flirt, and indulge in fantasy. The buzz began immediately. Everyone wanted to see the inside of the Vanderbilt castle.
The press went wild. The newspapers were printing descriptions of the house, the rumors of the costumes, the guest list. It was the Super Bowl of the Gilded Age. Young debutantes were spending months planning their outfits. Seamstresses were booked solid from the Battery to Harlem. If you were anyone, you had to be at this ball.
And this brings us to the Astor household. Caroline Astor had a daughter, Carrie. Carrie was young, lively, and very much part of the younger social set. She was excited about the Vanderbilt ball. She had organized a group of her friends to perform a specific dance at the party, known as the Star Quadrille.
The Star Quadrille was a choreographed dance where the young women would dress as stars, obviously, and perform synchronized movements. It was going to be the highlight of the evening's entertainment. Carrie Astor and her friends had been practicing for weeks. They had their costumes made. They were ready.
But then the invitations went out. The servants at the Vanderbilt mansion were dispatched to hand-deliver hundreds of invitations to the creme de la creme of New York society. The excitement was palpable, but at the Astor house, nothing arrived.
Silence. The postman brought nothing. The servants brought nothing. Carrie Astor waited and waited. Eventually, the truth dawned on them. They hadn't been invited.
Now, imagine the scene. Carrie is heartbroken. She's been practicing this dance with her friends, all of whom did get invitations. She has to tell them she can't go. She goes to her mother, arguably the most powerful woman in the city, in tears. She asks, "Why weren't we invited?"
And this is where Alva's genius comes in. It wasn't just petty spite, it was a procedural checkmate. In those days, strict etiquette ruled everything. According to the rules, a lady could not invite another lady to her home if the second lady had not first called on her. Calling meant visiting her home and leaving a visiting card.
Exactly. It was a formal acknowledgement of social recognition. You leave your card, she leaves her card, and then you are acquainted. Caroline Astor had never called on Alva Vanderbilt. In Caroline's eyes, the Vanderbilts did not exist socially. Therefore, technically, Alva Vanderbilt could not invite the Astors because she did not know them.
It was a trap. Alva used Mrs. Astor's own rules against her. She essentially said, "I would love to invite your daughter, but sadly, Mrs. Astor, you have never introduced yourself to me, so I cannot presume to invite your family." It was brilliant. It forced Mrs. Astor into a corner. Either she maintained her snub and broke her daughter's heart, causing Carrie to miss the social event of the decade, or she swallowed her pride.
The tension in the Astor household must have been thick enough to cut with a silver knife. Caroline Astor looked at her crying daughter. She looked at the reality of the situation. The Vanderbilts had eclipsed the old guard in terms of relevance. If the Astors weren't at this ball, they risked becoming irrelevant themselves. They risked looking like bitter relics.
So the command was given. The carriage was prepared. This is the moment, right here. The carriage ride that changed New York. Caroline Astor, dressed in her blue velvet and ermine, stepped into her barouche. She instructed her footman to drive her up Fifth Avenue to number 660.
Can you imagine the neighbors peeking out from behind their heavy curtains, seeing the Astor carriage stop in front of the Vanderbilt Palace? The footman hopped down. He walked up the massive stone steps of the Petit Chateau. He rang the bell. A Vanderbilt servant answered.
The footman presented Mrs. Astor's calling card. It was a small rectangular piece of cardstock, simply engraved with Mrs. Astor. That tiny piece of paper was a white flag of surrender. It signified that the House of Astor formally recognized the House of Vanderbilt.
The servant took the card on a silver tray. The footman returned to the carriage. Caroline Astor didn't even have to go inside. The act of leaving the card was enough. She drove away. But the deed was done. The ice had been broken. The blockade was lifted.
And predictably, within hours, a liveried servant from the Vanderbilt house arrived at the Astor mansion with a thick envelope. The invitation. The Astors were going to the ball.
Carrie Astor got to perform her Star Quadrille. But more importantly, the social landscape of America had fundamentally shifted. The ball itself, which took place on March 26, 1883, was a spectacle of excess that is hard for us to even comprehend today. We need to talk about what happened inside those doors, because it validates why the snub was so effective. This wasn't just a party, it was a fantasy world.
Let's paint the picture. The police had to hold back crowds of onlookers outside. Inside, the house was transformed. The gymnasium on the top floor had been turned into a forest with palm trees and flowers. The halls were lined with roses. And the costumes. These weren't spirit Halloween costumes. These were couture creations worth thousands of dollars.
Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II appeared as electric light,
That is a famous image. She wore a white satin dress trimmed with diamonds and actual battery-powered light bulbs. She held a torch that lit up. It was a celebration of modern technology and, of course, their immense wealth.
Her sister-in-law went as a hornet, complete with a headdress made of diamonds and imported taxidermied hummingbirds. There were people dressed as Louis XVI, as Joan of Arc, as mythological beasts. Alva herself dressed as a Venetian princess, accompanied by her husband as a duke. They posed for photos, which was also a relatively new thing for society events, ensuring the world saw their triumph.
And there, amidst the diamonds and the gaslight, was Mrs. Astor. She arrived late, as was her custom, and held court. By attending, she gave her seal of approval. The Vanderbilts were no longer new money upstarts to be ignored. They were society. The merger was complete. The Knickerbocker aristocracy had officially merged with the robber baron plutocracy.
This night didn't just invite the Vanderbilts in, it opened the floodgates. Once the Vanderbilts were accepted, the Morgans, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, all these industrial families realized that the old walls could be breached if you had enough money and enough audacity.
But there was a chaotic aftermath to this. With the walls breached, the definition of society became murky. Before, you knew who belonged because you knew who their grandparents were. Now, if anyone with $10 million could build a palace and throw a party, how do you know who is actually in? Caroline Astor and her right-hand man, Ward McAllister, realized they needed a new system. They needed a list.
Ah, Ward McAllister, the self-appointed arbiter of taste. He was this foppish, fastidious man who essentially made a career out of telling rich people how to behave. He was Caroline Astor's chamberlain. And after the Vanderbilt ball, he famously declared that there were only about 400 people in New York society who really mattered.
The 400. That phrase became legendary. People still use it today to describe the elite. But do you know why he picked the number 400? It wasn't based on a census. It wasn't based on a genealogical survey.
It was capacity. It was the number of people who could fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom. That's it. If you couldn't fit in the room, you weren't on the list. It was a velvet rope policy based on fire codes, essentially.
It sounds ridiculous, but it was a brilliant power play. By formalizing the list, McAllister and Astor tried to regain control. They published the list in the New York Times. Can you imagine? Reading the newspaper to see if you were officially in or out? It codified the social hierarchy. It turned society into a club with a membership roster.
But the irony is, by creating the list, they admitted that the old bloodlines weren't enough anymore. The list included the Vanderbilts. It included the new money. It was an admission that the Gilded Age was about money. If you had the cash to keep up with the lifestyle, the dresses, the balls, the summer cottages in Newport, you could make the list.
And that is the secret legacy of the snub. The night Caroline Astor surrendered to Alva Vanderbilt was the night the Gilded Age truly began in earnest. It shifted the center of gravity from lineage to liquidity. It created the culture of celebrity and competitive spinning that we still see echoes of today.
It was the night the old guard died and the glitterati were born. Caroline Astor remained the queen, but she was now a constitutional monarch. She ruled with the consent of the wealthy, not by divine right of the Dutch settlers. And Alva? She went on to be a suffragette, a builder of more mansions, and a general force of nature. But her greatest victory remained that single calling card.
So when we look back at the Gilded Age, at the mansions of Newport and the museums of New York, remember that much of it was built on this specific friction. The desire to be seen, the fear of being excluded, and the sheer power of a dinner party invitation. It wasn't just frivolity, it was the consolidation of American power.
It really makes you think about our own social structures today. Who are the Mrs. Astors now? And who are the Vanderbilts trying to get in? The names change, but the game? The game remains exactly the same.
Indeed it does. From the gaslit ballrooms of 1883 to the Met Gala of today, the rules of exclusion define the elite. But that is a story for another time. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the most expensive snub in history.
Don't forget to leave your calling card, or in this case, a like and a comment, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Let's actually double back for a moment, because there is one detail about Ward McAllister we glazed over that I think is crucial to understanding the texture of this era. We mentioned he was the chamberlain, but that understates his role. He was almost like a social engineer.
Oh, absolutely. McAllister is the unsung hero, or villain, depending on how you look at it, of this entire transition. He wrote a book later called Society as I Have Found It, which was basically a tell-all. But during the 1880s, he was the guy whispering in Mrs. Astor's ear. He created the patriarchs.
Right, the patriarchs' balls. This was his attempt to create a vetting system before the 400 list was officially published. He selected 25 men, patriarchs, from the best families. Each of them was allowed to invite a certain number of women and young men to these exclusive balls. If you didn't get an invite from a patriarch, you didn't go. It was a way of crowdsourcing the gatekeeping.
And this is where the friction with the Vanderbilts really started to grind. The patriarchs were initially very resistant to the new money, but money has a gravity of its own. When the Vanderbilts started marrying into European aristocracy, which is a whole other saga, the patriarchs couldn't hold the line. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Alva's daughter, eventually married the Duke of Marlborough. You can't tell the mother of a duchess that she isn't good enough for your ball.
That's the checkmate again. Alva played the long game. The 1883 ball was the opening battle, but the marriages were the occupation. But back to the night of the ball itself, I want to dwell on the menu for a second, because the excess wasn't just on their bodies, it was on their plates.
The catering was done by Delmonico's, the most famous restaurant in New York. They served a late supper at 2 a.m. 2 a.m. The menu included bouillon, terrapin, which is turtle soup, a massive delicacy then, canvasback duck, and champagne. Rivers of champagne. And remember, the house was so new, the staff was probably terrified of spilling anything on the $3 million floors.
And the music. They had 2 full orchestras, one for the dancing in the ballroom and another for background music in the supper room. It was a sensory overload. And for Carrie Astor, dancing that star quadrille, it must have felt like stepping into a dream. But for her mother, sitting on the sidelines, it must have felt like a funeral for her old world.
I think Caroline Astor was pragmatic, though. She saw the writing on the wall. There's a story that later in life she actually became quite fond of some of the new money wives. She realized they brought energy. The Knickerbockers were dying out. They were land poor. They owned real estate but didn't have liquid cash. The Vanderbilts had cash. They revitalized the scene.
That's a key economic point. Being land poor meant you had a great name and a big house, but you couldn't afford the upkeep, the staff, the dresses. The Gilded Age inflation, if you will, was driven by these industrialists. They raised the cost of being rich. To stay relevant, the old families eventually had to intermarry with the new money just to pay the bills.
So the snub and the resolution of the snub was really the first step in a massive wealth transfer and social merger. It wasn't just about a party. It was about survival. If Mrs. Astor had refused to go to the Vanderbilt ball, she might have maintained her dignity, but her grandchildren might have been destitute, socially and financially.
It's survival of the fittest, played out in velvet and silk. And Alva Vanderbilt was the apex predator. She knew exactly where to strike. You know, she later divorced Willie K. Vanderbilt, which was another massive scandal, and married O.H.P. Belmont. She kept her social standing the entire time. She was bulletproof.
Because she established the rules. Once you rewrite the rules, you can play by them however you want. That's the lesson of the 1883 ball. If the game is rigged against you, build a bigger stadium and invite everyone to your game instead.
A bigger stadium, or in this case, a French chateau on Fifth Avenue. It's a powerful lesson in leverage. The calling card incident is often taught as a trivia effect, but it's really a masterclass in social leverage. Alva had the supply, the best party, and she restricted the demand, the invites, until the regulator, Mrs. Astor, capitulated.
Capitalism at its finest, applied to the ballroom. It's brutal, it's effective, and it's dazzling. And that is why we are still talking about it 140 years later. We aren't talking about the polite teas held by the Van Rensselaers. We are talking about the electric light dress and the snub.
We are. It defined the era. The Gilded Age wasn't about politeness. It was about power. And on that night in 1883, power changed hands, from the old blood to the new money. And the bridge between them was a single small visiting card.
A perfect place to end. The card that bridged 2 worlds.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to this untold secret of the Gilded Age. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the politics of high society, make sure you are subscribed. We have many more stories of scandal, wealth, and power coming your way.
Until next time, mind your manners and keep your calling cards ready.
Goodbye, everyone.
Wait, before we go, I have to ask one hypothetical. If you were Alva, would you have done it? Would you have been that bold?
Oh, 100%. If I had $3 million to build a house and the queen of the city was ignoring me, I would have built it twice as big. The audacity is what makes her an icon. She refused to accept her place.
And Mrs. Astor? Do you think she respected the move?
I think she respected the strength. Mrs. Astor was a strong woman. She recognized strength in others. Weakness she despised. But Alva was a titan. Game recognizes game.
Game recognizes game. I think that's the perfect summary of the Gilded Age, just with more corsets.
And much better mustaches. All right, now we are really done. Thanks for listening.